Okay, folks, welcome. Thank you for coming to the next in the series of 30-minute methods seminars we have. And today we've got Rachel Tuff. Welcome. Welcome to TDTU. She's just completed her PhD at the University of East Anglia. She's also a fellow of the, what is it, Young Academic...
I'm a member of the Young Academy.
Young Academy UK.
Yes.
I have no idea what that is, but it sounded pretty impressive when you announced it. But she's more importantly got two research projects with the public anthropology. Is that right?
Yep.
Public-facing anthropology projects with the British Museum, which is pretty important. But she's going to talk to us today about method and uncertainty, serendipity, and opportunity in researching the COVID-19 crisis in Ho Chi Minh City ethnographically. This is part of our 30-minute methods, and welcome to Ho Chi Minh City. You live in, obviously, at present, but to TDTU especially.
Thank you.
And we'll just move that slightly. And it's all over to you.
Right. If there's any technical problems, they're my fault. So don't blame John. Thank you very much for coming, everyone who's in the room here. And thank you very much to John, Professor John Hutnick, for inviting me to present at 30-minute methods. And as John said, I'm a recently completed PhD student at the University of East Anglia, and my study, the study that I've completed, is about the COVID pandemic in Ho Chi Minh City. And I just submitted my thesis 2 weeks ago, so it's really nice to actually be able to get out of the library and speak to people about the research that I've been doing. So I think I've got about 25 minutes to talk to you about my research, and I'm going to try and do three things in that time. Maybe a bit ambitious, but we'll see. I'm planning to give you a brief overview of the main themes in my PhD study that I carried out here in Ho Chi Minh City. And I should just say I certainly didn't plan this project. I planned something very different. I planned a museum ethnography, but the pandemic started a few months after I started my PhD. So I had these lovely plans to go and do a year-long ethnography at a prominent museum in the city, but it couldn't happen. So I changed to react to the circumstances that were unfolding around me and the thing that was preoccupying my interlocutors in the city, the pandemic. Then I plan to talk a bit about accidental anthropology. So that's studies of unexpected things that just end up happening, emerging events. And apart from my study, who else has ended up studying disasters and other ruptures, having planned to study other things? Where did they do it? What are some of the barriers and enablers and the payoffs to researching the unexpected? And then after that, I plan to talk a bit about a methodological innovation driven by the disruption of COVID-19. And that is a participatory archiving project called Archiving COVID-19 Heritage in Ho Chi Minh City that serendipitously emerged out of the pandemic's disruption that I've been leading alongside Vietnamese colleagues over the past few years. Before I start, I should just say that I imagine most people in this room, including John, have got more experience of the pandemic in the city than I have, because I was here for some of the time, but I wasn't here for a chunk in 2021. So at the end, maybe if anyone wants to contradict things I've said, that would be great. I'm always looking to hear about people's experiences of that crazy time. Okay, right. So on to the next slide. I think that worked okay. So the study I carried out was an ethnography. So unsurprisingly, you can see on this slide that I used the usual anthropological research methods of participant observation. So that meant taking daily observations and making field notes, carrying out interviews and more in-depth life history interviews over several sessions while I lived within an alleyway community in District 4 between 2021 and 2023 off Duan Van Bur Street. I started taking observations and making notes when I was living in District 1, when the fourth wave was kind of developing. So the data that I gathered for this study spans the worsening period of intense fear, as I perceived it, when vaccines were really in short supply, and then the new normal period when we were getting back, life was returning to normal, although the city economy had obviously shrunk in that time. So it wasn't really normal, it was the new normal. So Vietnam's zero COVID policy, as I'm sure everyone remembers, aimed for maximum suppression of the coronavirus and ultimately to eliminate it. And that policy represents what we might call a total cooperation arrangement. So a unique regulation type situation under which state and society had to negotiate lots of government directives and government directives that impinged on more or reached into more areas of life than usual and necessarily limited individual freedoms for the common cause of slowing the spread of a deadly virus. Now, the data I've collected from conversations with regular city dwellers mainly focus on those intensified negotiations in local communities. So overall, the data boosts the dialogic interpretation of state-society relations in Vietnam, set forth by scholars like Hy Van Leung and Benedict Kirkvliet. So according to that school of thought, in Vietnam, policies are discussed and adapted at the local level rather than just imposed from the top down, as some external perspectives would have it. You can see here the themes of the empirical chapters. So they're the findings chapters, if you like. And I'll just skip through this because this isn't the main point of the talk. But the first chapter here that I talk about here is about how society responded to problems with food distribution in the city in 2021 during the lockdown. And I found Scott's moral economy theory and legal scholar Pham Duy Nghia's discussion of Confucian values in contemporary Vietnamese society useful in this regard. And so the data is showing me in my analysis that city dwellers' decisions about how to distribute these scarce resources and the setting of a fair price for goods that were in short supply reflects historical and socio-cultural factors such as collectivist mindset, benevolence, rather than profit-seeking behaviour. So I look at various forms of community support and charitable initiatives in that chapter. In the next chapter, I look at what I call knowledge frictions in the local implementation of the zero COVID policy. Obviously, implementing such a policy was stressful and it was unusual and involved negotiations at different levels of Vietnamese state and between the state and citizenry. So looking to learn from those negotiations, I developed a concept that I called Goli Godin, being both right and reasonable, to express the know-how of Vietnamese officials, drawing on my data about how the officials enforced, or maybe didn't fully enforce, policies like the stay-at-home order in the alleyways of District 4. And the third of these chapters looks at the ideological processes through which citizens were encouraged to comply with Vietnam's comprehensive and, at that time, world-beating coronavirus control policy. So I look at, I employ philosopher Louis Althusser's theory of interpolation and some of its critiques to explain how citizens were rendered subjects during the pandemic through the elaborate contact tracing regime, and look at the societal discombobulation, so the weirdness that I experienced and other city dwellers who I was in contact with experienced as that system wore off and we didn't have to be F0 or F1 anymore. It took a while to adjust to that process. So yes, I draw on some observations I made on Duong Hoa Flower Street in crowded situations after that contact tracing regime had finished. And I conceptualize it as de-interpolation. So I think that's an overview of the findings, and that's just a flavour of what the thesis argues. Maybe I'll be able to come back one day and talk in more detail about one of these chapters, but now I'll get on with talking about the methods. I should say the rest of what I'm going to talk about today forms the basis of a chapter of my thesis and also a manuscript that I've submitted to a journal a few months ago that hopefully will be published later this year. Okay. Right, so the global coronavirus pandemic thrust a new reality on ethnographers, one in which carrying out our research carried the risk of infecting others through immersive face-to-face fieldwork that we need as ethnographers could accelerate the spread of a deadly virus. And travel bans, university restrictions on fieldwork required many people to change their study site to switch to digital methods, to change their sampling strategy, postpone or even cancel their research, or make multiple such changes. The debates about how to adjust methodologically to the disruption of COVID-19 were vibrant and prompted the development of ideas like patchwork ethnography that some of you may have heard of, that reflects the reality of many anthropologists these days, that they can't carry out the archetypal 12 to 18 months of field work. It's not possible because maybe they have children, or they have a disability, or they're just not able to take that much time in the field. So that was the direction that those debates took in the time of COVID-19. But those debates are not about how to deal with the unexpected. Those are not new debates. And for ethnographers, the field has always influenced the research design. And this quote here up on the screen is quite apt for my own study. It posits that unexpected events are a key driver of the ethnographic method, and part and parcel of doing this kind of research, where the circumstances you encounter in the field shape the study that you end up doing. In the manuscript I've submitted, I've developed the notion of disruption as method to encapsulate how a researcher can work with rather than fight against disruptive events that they encounter in their research journey. So rather than throwing them off course, these events represent fruitful opportunities and can be studied if the right preparations are made. And in my case, I took inspiration from papers that I'd read by Vietnamese overseas who had returned and collected data in collective quarantine, to try and think about how I might do this myself. When I returned to Vietnam in December 2021, what would I do if my neighborhood was barricaded? When I returned to Vietnam, the Omicron variant was emerging. So we didn't know at that time whether the vaccines would be able to cope with it. And so I had to be quite flexible about what data I might end up being able to collect, how and in what circumstances. So this is about disruption as method, is about anticipating and trying to build resilience into your research plans so that you can carry on the study, even if something drastically changes, your circumstances change. So when I moved into my neighborhood, which was in District 4, as I mentioned, when I left quarantine in December 2021, I made sure I went around the local neighborhood and collected data, baseline data about what social life was like, just in case, as much as I could. So I went out as much as I could, just in case restrictions were imposed again and I couldn't go out. In the end, the most significant physical distancing restrictions were not reinforced in Ho Chi Minh City after they were repealed. The new variants did not break through the vaccines, and life continued to normalize throughout 2022. But by thinking about disruption as method, it became possible, more feasible for me to return to the field, because I'd be able to collect data even if the coronavirus went in another unexpected direction. Okay. Next slide. I should first of all say that this, I think Triet might be listening. This is a wonderful picture by Triet, who graduated from this university maybe a couple of years ago. One of Professor Hutnick's students who helped me with some aspects of this research. So this is his picture. Yeah, what I was moving towards in that last slide, but I didn't really state, was explicitly was the important role of serendipity in ethnographic practice. So what is serendipity? You can see here that it's considered an important ideal in scientific inquiry, the art of making an unsought finding, as Van Andel puts it, instead of a deliberate discovery. And ethnographers and anthropologists, including those on this slide here, have written about serendipity and recognized its importance over the years. Some have even described disasters as serendipity disguised as catastrophe. Now, we should think about that statement. While it might be true in some ways, we should be careful about how we interpret it, because obviously the COVID-19 pandemic led to many millions of deaths. So it was an undeniable human catastrophe, but it just so happened to serendipitously coincide with my doctoral fieldwork. So it did represent a remarkable opportunity to witness and put on the ethnographic record an extraordinary event and make a contribution to knowledge in the tradition of accidental anthropology that I will talk about on the next slide. And because such research cannot be planned in advance, ethnographic studies of disasters, revolutions, and other ruptures are few, meaning that researchers should seize these opportunities to do these kinds of studies if it's ethical and useful to do so. And in one of the slides that I'll move on to shortly, I talk about how the research, I judge my research to meet those conditions as being ethical and useful. So serendipity can exert its influence at different levels. We might call them the macro level. So I've already talked about changing my entire project, but it can also work at the micro level of day-to-day things that happen in daily life when we're doing our ethnographic research. So I'm just going to read something quite short from my thesis chapter about a random thing that happened in the alleyway that went onto where I lived that shaped the direction of my research. So on returning to Ho Chi Minh City in December 2021, I had to find a new fieldwork home at short notice. With little time and city-based contacts unwilling to go to District 4 to view properties on my behalf when I was in the UK because they were scared of the high COVID-19 rates in District 4, after looking at a few videos on Zalo Instant Messenger, I decided to move to an alleyway off a busy main street in District 4. So my new fieldwork home turned out to have lots of broken appliances. So broken fans, broken oven. This wasn't obvious on the Zalo video call. This was a bit of a shock, uncomfortable, inconvenient, and nearly transformed the idea of accidental anthropology into a dangerous reality. But the fact that I needed to get things fixed created conversations in the alleyway with my neighbours. So lots of people wanted to join in the conversation about these broken things. And it turned out one of my neighbours had developed skills in the subsidy period, Toy Balka, about fixing things. He was very good at fixing things. So he came around and I developed a good kind of relationship with this person. And also this led to discussions in the neighbourhood about how, what kind of standard of living do we want to have there in the alleyway. So that's just one example of how serendipity works at the kind of micro level in my research. Okay, so the literature on serendipity advises researchers, so how can we bring this about? So how can we, if something is chancy, how can we actually make this, bring this about in our research? So there are a few things we can do, even though lots of it depends on kind of luck. We can have wide open research questions that don't put us into a box before we've even started our research. So my question when I re-entered the field was, what does it mean to experience the COVID-19 pandemic in Ho Chi Minh City? And other things we can do include building up relationships with before we enter and start the field work. So ideally, if we have some of those relationships, we can start to work on them, and then serendipity might go our way when we do actually begin our study itself. But there's some debates around what we can actually do. We're limited in terms of institutional, some institutional factors can stop us from reaping like the serendipity dividend, I might call it. So the requirement to fill in ethics applications and health and safety checks is necessary, although some would say that this has gone too far in and kind of serves to stymie us as we try and research the unexpected. Okay, in the interest of time, I think for the next slide, I will just leave this slide up here, and there's a slide with some references in the end at the end of this talk, where you'll be able to read, look up these studies by various anthropologists in various Asian contexts, where I think these are all doctoral studies where the researchers planned to study one thing but ended up studying something completely different. And so I very much consider the study that I've done here as being basically the latest study in this series of Asia-focused accidental anthropology studies. Okay, how am I doing for time?
It's 20 past. So
Okay. So ethics. This slide is about pandemic ethics, and obviously before starting a study, in a coronavirus affected context. I carefully thought about potential benefits and harms of doing this research, and took measures to mitigate the risk of spreading COVID-19, such as wearing a mask and disinfecting. Those were included in my application for ethical approval, and I used those measures once I began collecting data. And also the Vietnamese authorities' own measures, such as requiring me and my partner to undergo hotel quarantine on 2 occasions, and to give evidence of having been vaccinated. Those also helped to reassure the ethics committee and myself that I wasn't endangering anybody by doing this, or I'd minimize the risk of endangering people from coronavirus transmission as much as I could. But as well as thinking about ethical issues in terms of ethics forms and ethics committees, I was thinking about anthropologist Oscar Salamink, who did a lot of work, sadly passed away, did a lot of research on Vietnam, who recommended an approach of emergent ethics. So encouraging us to think about ethics after we've completed the ethics application and when we're in the field. So what that meant in my experience was thinking about some of the stories that I was being told by people who I was meeting in the community, and asking myself whether it was appropriate to include them in the study at all, and also being aware that not everybody wanted to talk about the pandemic. They wanted to move on. So it may have been my research topic, but not everyone necessarily wanted to relive that, and had to respect that. So there's an interesting point about positionality that I'd like to make. So when I re-entered the field in 2021, December 2021, or in the context of the pandemic in general, my home country of the United Kingdom had a far less impressive record in suppressing the coronavirus. And I was in the position where I came to Vietnam in March 2021, when coronavirus rates were really high in my own country, but remained at that time relatively low in Vietnam. So when we're encouraged to think about our positionality in the first year of our doctoral studies, we're encouraged to think about our status as Western researchers from a former colonial power. And I did that in this situation with the pandemic. Vietnam, which is a country with fewer resources, we could say, had a far more impressive record in controlling the coronavirus. So I really did feel when people said to me when I returned, when I came to Vietnam, "You're safe here now," in March 2021. That was true. I was much safer in Vietnam than I was at that time in my own country. So it was interesting how the pandemic forced us to reconsider our positionality as researchers. Okay. Now, I'm moving on now to talk about something linked but quite different. So this is a project. Now I'm going to move on to talk about a project that was kind of a byproduct of the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a participatory archiving project called Chuyên Tôi Dịch, which I've been leading for the last few years, funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is the UK aid budget, and after that by a 2-year grant from my university's Impact Acceleration account. So this has had 3 years of funding. And the idea for this project came about when, partly through a conversation with Trit about some of the displays that were on Dung Hoa in 2022. I don't know if any of you went to go and see some of the kind of narratives about looking back at the pandemic, and how some people I knew didn't entirely feel that they represented their own views, or that they had maybe different memories that they would like to share. So the idea came about to ask city dwellers, when I was doing my ethnographic research, and I would get chatting to people and they would show me pictures on their phone, but more and more people were saying, "Oh, I've deleted them now, I'm deleting them, or my phone broke." So it felt urgent to try and capture these images before they were all gone. So I got together with some students from Fulbright University and a British Vietnamese collaborator, and we secured funding for this project. Move on to the next slide. Oops. Okay, there's some more Vietnamese there. Sorry, just give me a second. Yes. So during the pandemic, we had quite a few examples of innovative, citizen-focused examples of archival practice. So because this phenomenon was so extraordinary, lots of people took photos and lots of people had memories, and several researchers have set up projects to try and archive for future generations the experiences that people had during the pandemic. So with our project here, we sought to address some of what we call the epistemic exclusion. So some of the people's own truths being kind of maybe excluded from memory narratives about the pandemic, giving city dwellers a chance to record in words and images their own experiences of the pandemic. So we built a website, which this is one of the pages on the website, including a repository. And to kickstart this website, we ingested the project team, so me and Diana Lee and Quang, who have British Vietnamese connections, began collecting our own data, going around the city, talking to people, before we opened this up for the public to submit their own images. We're calling this a participatory rapid response archive. So the idea of rapid response ethnography kind of runs through this when we're just looking to grab the data that we can before it disappears. So given that over 90% of Vietnamese people have access to the internet through a smartphone, and to facilitate the easy sharing of photos, we decided to put our archive online rather than anywhere else. It seemed like the obvious choice to do that. So public deposit to this archive is supported via an intake form mapped to the collection's metadata template. And we deliberately wanted to set up an archive foregrounding visual knowledge, not only because the pandemic in Ho Chi Minh City, with its eye-catching signage, with all the plumes of disinfectant and hazmat suits, was a visually arresting phenomenon, but also recognising that the burden that participatory methods put on the community. So we made it as easy as possible for people to submit, rather than have to write a very long essay that not everyone might want to do, but lots of people seem to have photos on their phone, so it would be easier for more people to participate. Okay, and by reviewing photos stored on their smartphones and selecting, labeling and submitting what they deemed to be the most meaningful images, city dwellers engaged in a reflective process and reappraising their visual memories of specific times and places during the lockdown in light of subsequent events, because this data collection hack started through this website in 2023, so 2 years after lockdown finished. And some of the contributors to this project are coming along. Just one more slide here. This is nearly a good place to stop. Coming along to an event that I'm organising with Hao, Ngọc and Minh Tam, 3 students from Fulbright University, Vietnam, which is coming up at the start of March. There's some information about it here, and the QR code to sign up. Where we have invited some of the people who contributed to that archive to come along and speak more about the photo that they submitted and how their memories may have changed since that time, and get involved in a bit of a discussion. And we really recognise that the longitudinal dimension of the reanalysis here allows us to capture the intersection of biographical and historical change over time. So that allows us to build up a multidimensional analysis. And ultimately, the project team plans to share their data openly so that this archive can act as a public good. And I've drawn on the data that was collected on that website in my doctoral dissertation. And yeah, the website is there for other researchers to use as well. I think I've probably exceeded my time now. So
Well, you've got a bit of time, but
Okay.
if that's a good place to stop, let's stop there. It's nice.
Maybe, yeah, okay.
Okay. So thank you so much for that. That's really great. What we might do is stop sharing, and I'll start off with a question. And I guess I'll ask you. I've got two competing questions in my head. One is about the resources. So I'm taken by the fact that everyone's got a phone, and it's important to capture things, the vanishing present as it before it disappears, and that's a great opportunity. And I guess though that makes me think of the wider project or the wider question for anthropologists is how opportunist anthropologists are. I mean, that's always been a part of our discussion in anthropology, and it goes way back. My teacher was a guy called Klaus-Peter Köpping. He wrote a book called Shattering Frames, where he talked about the trickster figure as a method for an anthropologist. My undergraduate teacher was Malcolm Crick, and he talked, because of his name being like Crick and Watson, he talked about the importance of play in anthropological fieldwork, because he was thinking about Crick and Watson discovering DNA by playing with building blocks and accidentally finding out how to put it together, right? And the importance of that accident of just mucking around and finding ways. And Köpping, Klaus-Peter Köpping's teacher was Kurt Wolff, who wrote that great book, Surrender and Catch. But I was hoping that you would take it in a different direction. And maybe you can expand on this, because I suspect you might have. When you said there were fewer resources in Vietnam, yet Vietnam did a better job with the pandemic than England did, and I'd agree, having kids going to school in England because they opened the schools because they didn't care, and Boris Johnson and so on. You said fewer resources, but maybe it's that there's different resources. And so that accident makes us think about the assumptions, the values we place on certain things that you take for granted in a way. So that the opportunity is one to change what you're planning to do and rethink what you're doing. And you were going to say, well, you did mention Althusser a little bit on one of the slides, but didn't really go into it. And I was thinking, Althusser, I don't know that much about Althusser, except that he was critiqued by Trendon here, but he wrote a lot about Machiavelli. So when I'm thinking about different words for opportunism, Machiavellianism, the Machiavellian kind of unscrupulous opportunism dimension of it comes in. So opportunism is a big word for communists, right? Against the opportunists and so on. So maybe you could expand on how you rethought your project and the ethics of that in terms of, I mean, serendipity, dividend. It's contradictory, isn't it? Because dividend is a word that comes from the language of finance and profit and commerce. And yet something else, some other kind of resources were involved here, weren't there? More human, more community, more collective.
Well, I mean, serendipity, yeah, we could call it opportunism instead. And Daniel Miller wrote an interesting article where he described it as just that serendipity sounds kind of cute and cuddly when actually you have to, it's about seizing opportunities. But I mean, to be frank, it was, for me, it was switch to online methods or don't have a PhD, or switch to studying the pandemic, or don't have a PhD anymore. And I'd given up a really good job, to start which involved a lot of desk work. It was a lovely desk that overlooked Tower Bridge. It was really nice. But I'd done it for 7 years and I didn't want to be at a desk anymore. So I really wanted to be in Vietnam. I didn't want to, I don't criticize, I speak in my thesis about how I ended up gathering the majority of the data. I had some people like Triet who very kindly did some in-person ethnographic reports for me in 2021 when I was back in the UK. The majority of my data came from face-to-face fieldwork. I don't judge people who ended up switching to online methods, but I think it's down to your personal circumstances as to how opportunistic you need to be. So
I guess, sorry, I didn't make it clear enough. My question was, how will you take this what you learned from this forward? How does that, recognizing that we have to rethink our evaluations about what our resources are, and that serendipity is a positive value. I mean, I don't think you had that when you were going to work in a museum. Did you or didn't you? I mean, it was we talked a lot about that project, and it was kind of like, let's just go and do it, right? There wasn't this, let's put ourselves in the way of accidents. And that's what was great about the pandemic in a way, but that's also the great failure, because it was this great opportunity to rethink everything. Like, tourism stopped. Tourism industry could have rethought itself. Transport stopped, and the city was fantastic in terms of air, except that you could also breathe in pandemic, the COVID virus, but planes stopped and there was no vapor trails in the sky. But that opportunity has not to rethink all of those things hasn't really been taken.
That's really interesting you're saying that, because I think the opportunism, so talking about the opportunism that you need to have as a researcher. Yeah, there was that wider opportunity. Do you remember there was a website, I've forgotten its name now, where you could view Saigon streets without traffic, and lots of people logged on because it was like a utopian moment to think about, how could the city be otherwise? How could we have this nice habitable city? And I think people that I know certainly took the time to reassess their life. When they were stuck at home, maybe these are the more middle class people that I got to know, they worked on self-improvement and thinking about where they want their life to go, and they're thinking about, what are my priorities? People in the Hem where I was living, their housing was too crammed for them to sit around, thinking about self-improvement. It was really tough. But yeah, you're right to say that the pandemic was an opportunity to rethink the city and Vietnam, where it's going. But the pollution, Hanoi is the most polluted city now, I think, in the world, I was reading.
No, I think there's a few in India that manage a bit better, but it's pretty bad. It is pretty bad.
And here,
how do we hold on to, put ourselves in the way of, and I think in a way what you're doing with people having phones in their pocket and saying, well, let's make that a research tool. The opportunity is to make everyone a researcher.
Yeah.
Is also
citizen archivist. Yeah.
But let me open it up to questions, because we've got a room full of people. But if you ask a question, you kind of have to come and sit here because of the microphone.
Do you want to come and sit next to me, ask me a question? I don't bite.
Okay. You have one? Go for it then.
Really, in the pandemic, during the pandemic periods, I heard that you talk about the agency of the people among the pandemic, and it's built a circumstance morality in this period. And I observed that obviously that this circumstance morality behavior becomes a habit nowadays, like wearing a mask during pandemic period become a habit for people nowadays, or something like. I think that I observe that it also affect further the period the behavior of the people after the pandemic, and that also not change the relationship between the resident and the local government office, because is after before the pandemic, the local government office do not have a lot of power and control in the morality and behavior of the people. And I wonder that it is the circumstance morality in that pandemic period is building the new morality, and
That's very interesting. Yeah.
And it's this new morality is affecting on the its impact on the society nowadays. Like you have a lot of behavior that affecting after your
So interesting to me. Yeah. I'd love to talk this new morality. So do you mean charitable things that people do? Like, we've got the Chada fee. The free Chada, which I don't know. I didn't see that before the pandemic. So kind of the zero dong market, which I went to
Yeah,
the new Easter bus station, they won there. You mean that kind of thing, like charitable?
and charity, and we have more morality about helping people during the pandemic period, and after that the people also still do it, and they believe on local government office is increasingly you can observe it, and that's why I think that impact that's build new ideology about the morality nowadays.
So interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Can we do an interview? I'm interested in what you said about the mask wearing. So you think that's a morality or civility?
I think this is belong to behavior, but the thing that you wear mask to protect not for only for yourself, but also protect for your family, your friend, and something like this is also a new morality for the people nowadays, because this is not popular before the pandemic, but now this is also widespread, and you can see other people wearing a mask when they go outside. And beside that, the charity, people do more the charity and believe on the local government office more than the before the pandemic.
We should talk about this afterwards. It's really interesting what you're saying.
And
You have another question? Musical chairs, sorry.
I will move. Thank you so much.
Hello.
So I know this talk is mostly focused about research method, but I'm really curious about the theory approach to. I see you mentioned two theory, moral economy of Jim Scott and ideology, of Husserl. Yeah, can you talk more about how they relate to the COVID in Vietnam?
Yeah, so where should we go first? With the Althusser,
Yeah,
with
okay.
that,
Moral.
you want me to talk about moral economy first? Okay. So I was thinking about some of the data that I collected that was the most stark was from people who had not had, hadn't had enough food and had struggled to get hold of food, and how the solution to that was, often involved, if the state couldn't provide it, community solutions. So James Scott's moral economy theory fit really well for thinking that, because he popularized that theory thinking about Vietnamese peasants like over 50 years ago. And so given that it deals with how people get hold of scarce, limited goods at a time of scarcity, and how people go around deciding what's a fair price for various essential items, it seemed to fit really well with the situation. And from what I saw, so examples from my data, such as, you probably heard of some people tried to take advantage of the situation by increasing the price. Like some shippers were trying to charge more money for some people I spoke to get food just a short distance away. And so the community tended to come either in person, get together, or on Zalo, and shame those people trying to charge too much. So that's a mechanism for setting their price. And so these rip-off, scenarios didn't last that long. So there's not really time to go into that much detail now, but the idea that people might act like rational actors and try to get, as much as they can for themselves, that didn't seem to, bear itself out in the data I collected. And then in terms of the Althusser's theory of ideology, well, I don't know about you, but for me, the contact tracing system was a really powerful, in my interpretation, way of turning citizens into subjects. So it was materially performed. So when someone became an F0, the people would wear the blue suits and they'd come in the community and there'd be disinfectant. It was performed, very much performed. Sorry. And I think maybe it's a train of thought there. I found that, a very powerful, and there was a set of commands that you had to go into the institutional quarantine. You had to say where you've been, and that was a very powerful form of interpellation. turning someone into a subject. And then I found one of the weirdest things I've experienced. And when I was with Triet and others we had a photo group when we met up during the new normal. Do you remember when we were no longer officially, the contact tracing system had finished, we were in the new normal, but people were adjusting. It was so powerful. It had an afterlife, so people were adjusting. I had someone, people would do that in different ways. Members of the group turn up in a mask, or maybe they would dial in instead. Everyone was saying, well, I think that maybe I'm an F2, but I'm not sure, or maybe my friend is an F1. People weren't quite sure how to act at that time. So it's like, you're then not a subject. You're free to, you're not being put in quarantine. How do you then act? There was this strange process of de-interpolation, I called it. I'd love to talk more about that, but
It was really interesting.
hopefully I'll publish something about it.
Yeah. Thank you
Thank
for
you for
your
your question.
Question from Khan.
Yeah.
You'll have to come over here, I'm sorry. And then anyone with a checks shirt will ask, because we just had 2 checks shirts. So that's you, Mike.
Hello.
I have some
Yeah. Okay.
question about the methods. Like, I have a friend, a colleague who took a post-qualitative inquiry, took a PhD, and I feel that there's similarity in post-qualitative inquiry, same peers. So that's kind of like, you don't get guided by any method or any kind of ontology. Just have a topic and then you explore it. Two different methods. I feel some resonance with your research, but my question is related to the logistic with like usually supervisor, they require you to know your plan very well. To present the proposal and then stuff like that. Like, how could you convince your supervisor to go along
Good question.
with that? That's my first question. And then my second question is that nowadays we are within neoliberal academia, so we're under pressure to publish.
Yeah.
So this kind of method take time.
Yeah.
And but because I'm come from primarily quantitative research, so we usually have a large set of data and publish a few papers that are very quick. So how do you cope with that kind of pressure, or would you like to cope with that kind of pressure?
Okay, your first question about the plans, so making the plans.
Yeah.
So yeah, in most universities, I think, and in mine, you have to create a confirmation paper. So you do that, basically an 8,000 word plan. So I did that about my museum study. Then you present it to the department and your peers and get feedback, maybe make some changes, and you formally endorsed. You don't get kicked off the program. No one gets kicked off, but they say, okay, you can go ahead. So I did that, exam and got that approval in, it would have been like April, which by then, April 2020, Vietnam's border had already closed, but we didn't know, maybe it would, this is the thing, it's a moving target. We didn't know when it was going to open again. So I was approved for that. And then, I spent a year of my life trying to get permission to get inside Vietnam with the paperwork, right? So finally I was able to get back in and try and do that study. I was in touch with the museum, kept in touch with them when I got back into Vietnam in March 2021, and then the 4th wave happened. So I wasn't obliged to, but I decided, it became clear to me. So I wrote a short article for City and Society about what I'd seen in the 4th wave, and then took some advice from various people in, Vietnam studies, saying, do you think studying COVID is that, and kept trusted my instinct in a way. And then I created another 8,000 word plan and sent that to my supervisors. They bought into it. So they said, yeah, we think this is a good idea. Went through the ethics again. So it was approved by the university. That's when I was back in the UK. I had, time to think and replan. So I did go through all those institutional processes. And got the support of all the relevant bodies. So when I was saying earlier about ethics and health and safety and all of that, I do believe in them. And went through all those processes. It's just that they can, arguably it's gone a bit far, like asking how many people are you going to come into contact with when you do participant observation.
There is another level in the mind of supervisors. I mean, there's all of that and the credibility of the research and so on. But also there's this little hurdle that is benchmarked. will this person be able to deliver without taking 10 years or 5 years, like they did? Because back in the day, you could spend 8 years doing the PhD.
Yeah.
It's not available anymore in the metrics in the world of publishing parachute and so on. It's really, and you did it twice. You delivered 2 8,000-word proof of concept, but it's also proof of ability to write, to deliver. That's a big part. Did you have a second part?
Your second question was about publish or perish, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Publish
like it's ethnography itself take a long time
Yeah.
to get a set of data. And whereas me from quantitative research, we should talk pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It's very meaningless, whereas
Yeah.
ethnographic is very rich detail.
It's delayed. I mean, I've
Yeah.
published, you know, the regular things that you would do in your doctoral journey, like your book reviews, the short article I mentioned in City and Society. I've submitted another manuscript for publication, but yeah, it's all it's all about the writing. And so I have to say, I think I've probably got enough data to last me like 10 years, you know,
Right.
a lot. So I don't feel like I'm not worried at all about running out. It's just like, yeah, needing to have a position where it's like a financially viable lifestyle. I've got all this data and wanting to get it out there and being realistic about, you know, how many writing projects you can take on at a time.
And now I think. Is there a question? Oh, well, let's take the question. So we're going to read it. How do you interpret the relationship between Althusser's concept of interpolation and I can't read it properly.
Negotiation.
Kierkegaard's notion of that dialogic negotiation. In the context of the announced COVID-19 contact tracing system, did the system produce subjects who solely complied with the state ideology, or did it also create space for negotiation, resistance, and dialogue between the state and society? From my perspective, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the power relationship appeared one-sided, heavily favouring the state. Why is it still considered a dialogue?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you. So Hiban reminds us that it can still be a dialogue even if dialogue partners are unequal. So the state and citizens, so they're not equal partners in that dialogue, but they still have a conversation. So, sorry, my eyes are wet.
Sally.
Sally. Yeah, so there was definitely space for negotiation. Like in the chapter that I've written about this, I talk about refusal and redirection of these interpolations. So just give you an example of refusal. So I'm thinking about Donghua, the Flower Street. We have the PA system, so we have the audio message telling citizens to download the PC COVID app, download it. No one's listening. People are having a nice, happy time. There's a lot of, you know, shouting and there's some music. In that way, the state's message is being refused. It's a subtle way, you know, this isn't a riot in the street, but people are not paying attention to that interpolation. And then in terms of it being directed, if we think about, so civility discourse was heavily implicated in this interpolative process. If we think about examples of, we've got the super rich, someone who went to Paris Fashion Week that you may remember and came back and didn't quarantine. So that kind of was state messaging being redirected towards someone there to hold them to account for their behaviour that didn't fit to the norms at that time, as per the kind of ideological emphasis at that time. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, thank you. Because during the COVID-19, I live in Yabe district. It's not so far from District 4 where you live. But the experience I have with citizens, with everyone, are totally different from yours. Because from my side, the government does not really support. And there's also a huge protest in my area. So I also have to encourage everyone to donate money so I can buy stuff like rice and egg too, and milk. And then I bring it to 4,000 families in the district. district. So I mean, my experience and everything I have experiences are totally different from yours. So that's why I'm asking. Thank you.
Are you talking about the provision of scarce goods at that time? Slightly different to the workings of ideology? Because I certainly did hear stories about people in, when the state was they were acting without the state to look after the community when state support was lacking. Because I certainly heard stories like that, whether it was in District 4 or out in District 9 when I went to go meet people out there. But I'm interested in the protests that you mentioned, because I'd only heard of one, I mentioned in my thesis, one incident where that happened in the city.
Yes, I'm just wondering about the dialogue concept because the state did not really interact with the people while the people are just dialogue with themselves. So I'm just wondering about the concept as like why you call it a dialogue and it seems here you talk about the concept of the interpolations and notion of dialogic negotiation. Yes, just that's it.
That's really interesting that you say that, because I suppose we have to think of the dialogue in the broader context of people not getting what they want and not being listened to, sometimes, but there is this space for dialogue. So the dialogue happens as part of a bigger context.
Okay.
And then I'm just talking about dialogue
I'll
as
with you
well.
later.
Sorry, Sally. Talk
I
earlier.
mean, I hope I can discuss with you more later because
Yeah, I'd love to. Do you wanna I don't know if
Yeah, we can fix
we can fix that up. That'd be lovely, thank you.
We should mention there's a few members of our faculty that have written on COVID-19 and the Vietnamese response. So you can see that in the special issue of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, article by Kim Phong, Dang T. Kim Phong, and another one by Fan. Okay, thank you so much for that. We
Thank you very
set
much.
up front and
Thank
take
you for the
photos. We'll
questions.
end the online part, I suppose. We will put the post up. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for giving us your 30-minute methods and a
Thank
bit
you.
of discussion. It's a great project. I should have mentioned earlier, there's also an article in Current Anthropology, right? And there
That's
should be, that was one of the early ones.
Yes.
And there should be more coming, right? So we also want to give you this, and we'll take a photograph for the memory. So while we're on screen, this is the departmental bag and some wow, some interesting things in there. So some
Thank you.
treats.
Thank you very much.
And, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and thanks for those of you who are online. I don't know how I do that.